Bonjour and welcome to the U.S. Civil Society Final Perspectives from the Front Lines for the third cycle of the U.S. UPR event. This is an exciting event featuring the authors of the stakeholder reports that were drafted by the UNA USA for the third UPR cycle. We cover many important topics, including election integrity, climate action, race, gender, and criminal justice, gun violence, immigration, women's rights, and more. We're very excited to be able to share with you from the ground here to Geneva about what we feel are the most important questions and recommendations that you could pose to the United States when it'll be reviewed on November 9th at 2:30. I'd like to welcome Rachel. Rachel Pittman is the Executive Director of UNA USA, and I'd like to thank you, Rachel, so much for opening our event today.
Great, thank you, Joshua. Welcome everyone, and on behalf of UNA USA, I want to thank you for joining today's event. I also want to extend a special thank you to the UN missions that are present here today. We appreciate you taking a moment out of your busy schedules to be with us. And of course, it's excellent to see so many leaders of UNA USA, especially after a long night of watching 2020 election results that are still coming in. Now is a very, historical moment for us. And I also want to share a little bit history about UNA USA for those who are not aware of our past. UNA USA is proud to have had the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who played a central role in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights amongst its earliest members and human rights champions. After Ms. Roosevelt helped shepherd the UDHR to its completion, she resumed her work with UNA USA and established a network of chapters across the country as chairwoman of the association. And through her work, UNA USA's support for the UDHR grew and never stopped. So today, UNA USA is a nationwide grassroots movement of Americans dedicated to advancing the values and interests of the UN. We are the largest global network of UN advocates with 20,000 members and over 225 chapters in 45 states across our country. On the UPR in 2019, our chapter network and partners came out in force. They completed more than 30 consultations on a variety of human rights challenges across the US, ranging from ensuring election integrity, which is very timely these days, to gender equality. These consultations brought together a diverse group of participants, including those from the business sector, faith-based communities, civil society, and local government, because we believe that anyone of any background can engage in the UPR process. While the US official UPR review will happen in a few days, know that UNA USA will continue to uphold the UDHR and engage US officials to improve human rights here at home and around the world. And if you want to follow our work, please visit us at unausa.org. With that, I'm happy to turn the virtual mic, back over to our moderator, Joshua Cooper, who's chair of UNA USA's Human Rights Affinity Group and a UNA USA National Council member. A pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and also reminding us about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's really why the UPR is such an important review, because the record of ratification does not include economic, social, and cultural rights, which many people are talking about, but which Eleanor Roosevelt knew was so important and said that all human rights are interconnected and indivisible, so that we definitely can focus on the economic, social, and cultural rights this evening. And I'd like to then hand it over to Grace Anderson, who will give a UNA USA report overview with the UN Foundation. Grace.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here and good to see you all. I'm Grace Anderson. I'm a policy associate at the UN Foundation and helped compile a lot of the reports that UNA USA submitted for the UPR. So I thought I would start off today with just a brief overview of how UNA USA's reports were picked up in OHCHR's summary report that was released earlier. So to start off, out of the 139 official shadow report submissions for the entire US UPR, UNA submitted 11 reports individually and with partners. And overall, our submissions were cited 42 times throughout the 10-page OHCHR summary report. And as Joshua mentioned, these citations cover topics related to women, migrants and refugees, gun violence, climate change, election integrity, and much more that you'll hear about later. And specifically wanted to mention that UNA chapters were mentioned specifically by name in the report 3 separate times. So I'll just cite those for you. The first was, quote, UNA USA stated that the Violence Against Women Act had lapsed in February 2019 and was yet to be renewed by Congress. The second mention was, quote, UNA Southern New York stated that at the beginning of 2017, the USA had issued several executive orders or taken other actions designated to restrict immigration. And finally, the third was, quote, UNA Southern New York stated that the conditions of confinement of children were reported to vary greatly from limited to deplorable, with review by outsiders highly circumscribed. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of our reports and how they were integrated into that summary report. And hopefully you'll be able to hear more from some of our grassroots chapter members. So back over to you, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Grace. And that shows really how we worked across the country, from the East Coast all the way out to Hawaii, to make sure that everyday members of UNA were able to have a voice in policymaking, and more importantly, not just focus on naming and shaming, but framing and claiming the rights that we think are most important. Next up, I'm really honored to feature Ryan Kaminsky with UNA Brooklyn. He'll be talking about LGBTQIA rights and the right to water. Ryan.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Before I start, I just want to beg the participants' indulgence, as folks have mentioned before, as last night was a late night. And so any incoherencies are absolutely my fault. And a quick note on methodologies. We at UNA USA were happy to engage a wide variety of constituencies across the country, including participants from all 50 states for these recommendations and findings. And while the deadline for our shadow reports was before the COVID-19 pandemic, clearly the pandemic has laid bare the existing inequalities in societies, and many of the challenges that we mentioned today, both in my intervention as well as others, are probably magnified and even worse and exacerbated by the results of the pandemic. And thank you to UNHRC members of the staff of OHCHR and UNA USA for continuing their work in these unprecedented times, including on the UPR. First of all, on the right to water, during its second UPR, unfortunately, the US only noted 2 recommendations pertaining to human rights and water. It didn't accept those recommendations, so there's needed for a greater focus on this during the upcoming UPR. A recent visit to the US by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty found that in Alabama and West Virginia, this is the Special Rapporteur speaking, I was informed of that significant challenges related to the status of potential water, and neither state was able to obtain figures as to the magnitude of the challenges or details of any government plans to address the issues in the future. Other folks in our consultations pointed out to serious infrastructure-related problems connected to water across the US, including the presence of lead pipes. The widely publicized events in Flint, Michigan are emblematic of these issues. Similarly, there's a lack of awareness on these challenges and the potential impacts of contaminated water among the US population. Significant challenges also are related to the presence of toxic Superfund dumping sites, including in northern New Jersey. According to one respondent from the consultations, there was no functional water fountains in some schools in the Newark public school systems. So our recommendations on water are as follows. Expand national resources to ensure proper water testing, inspections, and research related to the impacts of contaminated water. 2, implement a national affordability plan to ensure access to safe and clean water, especially among marginalized populations. And 3, develop and implement a long-term strategic plan to repair and strengthen water-related infrastructure. Moving on to sexual orientation and gender identity, we're really proud to get inputs for our shadow report from UNA Greater Detroit, UNA New York, UNA USA National, as well as other partners across the country. First, some good news. The US has consistently voted in favor of resolutions at the UN HRC. It also recently passed the National Suicide Hotline Designation Act. This was after the submission of our shadow report. And the Supreme Court found in September that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects against employment discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. However, now on to the bad news. Not only has the current administration opposed comprehensive domestic LGBTI non-discrimination legislation, it has also instituted policies that have negatively impacted the civil and political, as well as economic and social rights of LGBTI individuals in the country on multiple levels, which I refer you to UNA Shadow Report. In the last 2 years, there have been multiple documented cases of deaths of transgender women of color seeking protection in the US. Roxana Hernandez from Honduras and Johanna Medina Leon from El Salvador died in Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE custody. Cameron Diaz Cordova was denied asylum and deported back to El Salvador from the US. 3 months after being sent back to El Salvador, she was found dead outside city limits. LGBTI youth also face heightened challenges for their well-being. Nearly half of LGBT homeless youth in America, as estimates indicate 40%, identify as LGBTQ. When youth can access safe and permanent housing, the rates of health issues when they can't access safe and affordable housing, the rates of health issues and their health tends to decline. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the strain on social protection systems in the US. On to recommendations. Pass comprehensive national legislation to ensure that sexual orientation and gender identity are considered protected classes, for example, the Equality Act. Pass a nationwide ban on so-called conversion therapy. Ensure safe, sanitary, and dignified conditions for all asylum seekers, migrants, and refugees. And finally, ensure law enforcement officers receive training to end police brutality, prevent arbitrary arrest, and combat discrimination against LGBTI individuals in both public settings and attainment facilities. And I refer you to our report for other recommendations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and definitely appreciate all of your constructive recommendations for how the U.S. could move forward and live up to its international human rights obligations as well as constitutional. The next speaker is definitely quite important as we look at election integrity. We have Marcia Brewster who will speak to us. And it's important when we look at what was said at around a little bit after midnight. Joe Biden made his statement saying, keep the faith. But at 2:22 a.m., we had two statements. One, a very sad group of people is trying to disenfranchise that group of people, and we won't stand for it, we will not stand for it, made by the president. And then even worse, we were going to win this election. Frankly, we did win, so we'll be going to the US Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. As far as I'm concerned, we already did win. Fortunately, on social media said that is not the case. And also no news channel agreed with that as well. So far as we're meeting this early morning in Geneva, Joe Biden has 227 electoral votes, while Donald Trump has 213. And we know, of course, that threshold is 270. And we'd like to definitely thank Marcia for coming and sharing with us some of the important issues that we identified and that are still relevant today. Thank you.
I'm Marcia Brewster. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the UNA Westchester chapter in New York. And the last year, in September, the Citizens for Voting Integrity, the Southern New York State Division of UNA, and UNA Westchester held a consultation related to voting or election integrity. And as Joshua said, it couldn't have been more timely, and we are so glad we held this consultation. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that every citizen has the right to vote without unreasonable restrictions. Now, the US is a party to this, and yet there was widespread incidents of voter suppression, disenfranchisement of voters, and inaccessibility of voting in many places. And of course, with COVID-19, it became even more difficult for people to get to voting places. And many of those locations were restricted. Also, the US government has been accused of overlooking threats to election integrity, such as international interference and unreliable voting technology. We brought together 27 experts and citizen representatives last September, and we looked at three main areas of problems with the election system in the US. First, flawed election administration. The phenomenon of gerrymandering, and I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but it redraws voting districts along party lines so that one party always wins a district, even though it's a very odd shape. And it reduces the voting power of various groups. It's widespread in the US. Moreover, minority parties and candidates face heavy obstacles to entering the race. And so we are essentially a two-party system. Secondly, disenfranchisement of vulnerable populations. Disenfranchisement of millions of US citizens is unacceptable and a violation of their human rights. Many of these who are being disenfranchised are formerly or currently incarcerated persons, immigrant naturalized citizens, and citizens of Hispanic heritage, as well as visually impaired or otherwise disabled people. And then there have been widespread recent incidences of people being turned away from the polls for various minor and inconsistent application of election rules. Finally, the security of voting methods. There's currently a lack of transparency and oversight regarding the security of electronic voting machines in the US. Any vulnerabilities in these electronic voting systems could potentially allow hackers to distort votes and the election results. And this may be happening right now, we don't know. So I'm just going to give a very short summary of the recommendations to enhance measures to create a more accurate 2020 census. This did not happen. In order to ensure accurate redistricting and address the issue of gerrymandering. Secondly, to immediately end the disenfranchisement of currently or previously incarcerated people, naturalized citizens, and disabled people. Third, uphold the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to combat voter suppression by states and localities with records of voting rights suppression. 4, promote the use of paper ballots to ensure security, establish national standards for voting machines, this is very important, and introduce procedures for tight and publicly guarded chain of custody of ballots. And finally, increase funding for voting security measures such as ensuring machine safety, training of election personnel, and monitoring of voting centers. That's a very short summary of what we found, but as you can see, playing out in real time, we have a large problem with election integrity in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcia, and thank you for highlighting all of the issues and, more importantly, illuminating them prior, but coming up with what we know are steps that can be taken to ensure voter integrity and to move in the right direction. Our next speakers come from St. Louis, and they'll be looking at very important issues focusing on race, gender, and criminal justice reform. We have human rights defenders and local UNA chapters, and this couldn't come too soon. We're asking you, the UN missions, even though the US is an ally, to definitely make really good, smart recommendations. Just Monday, President Donald Trump officially established the President's Advisory 1776 Commission, celebrating and promoting, quote, America's founding and values in an executive order. And it is, quote, we will state the truth in full without apology. We declare that the United States of America is the most just and exceptional nation ever to exist on earth, end quote. So with that exceptionalism, I think we have two amazing advocates from St. Louis who will show, unfortunately, just how unexceptional we are and how we have to do a lot of work focusing on race in the United States to realize those important articles of the UDHR. Luz and Chantal.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Joshua. My name is Luz Rooney. I'm the Vice President of the United Nations Association in St. Louis, and I'm here with Chantal Fisher, who is founder of the Soul Fisher Ministries. She was the advisor and is guest speaker for our UPR consultation on criminal justice reform. So I want to thank the United States for submitting the UPR report and for taking part of this important review process. We welcome the adoption of the First Step Act, which was by the US in 2018. However, the United Nations Association of St. Louis still remains very concerned about the over-incarceration of African-American women and about the criminalization of minor and non-violent drug offenses, such as use or possession of drugs in communities of color. This violates the UN rules of the treatment of women offenders, compromises the SGD target 3.5 and the Bangkok rule number 15. I'm going to yield the floor to Chantel, who's going to give us the recommendations. Thank you.
Thanks, Luz. Hello, everyone. As Luz shared, I am Chantel Fisher. I'm the founder and CEO of a nonprofit here in St. Louis, the Soul Fisher Ministries. And our mission is to respond to the needs of youth with incarcerated parents and to promote restorative justice for those currently or formerly incarcerated. I myself was involved with the criminal justice system, stuck in a cycle of recidivism for over 20 years of my life. And so it's no surprise that I was called to come out of that and then go back and try to implement programs and services that empower women to break free of that cycle of recidivism. As Ryan shared, COVID-19 has definitely impacted our work within the prisons, and that we have had to cease our programming, in-person programming in the women's prisons we serve, and then pivot to a virtual model of program delivery in the local jails in St. Louis that we actually serve. So the recommendations that we have are with regards to the criminal justice system, more importantly, how they impact women. And so the first recommendation would be to use alternatives such as diversion programs to incarcerating women for low-level nonviolent offenses like drugs, fraud, and theft, as these offenses are most often just simply linked to poverty. Our second recommendation would be to use alternatives such as drug treatment, housing, employment, and mental health services, and expand access to programs and services that promote pre-entry and re-entry as better options than incarceration. Our third recommendation would be to use both culturally responsive and gender responsive alternatives that support the unique needs and traumatic backgrounds of low-level nonviolent women involved with the criminal justice system. And our fourth recommendation would be to provide access to programs and services that promote academic, social, and emotional well-being for children of incarcerated women. And then lastly, to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, to include non-discriminatory arrest, incarceration, and sentencing of African-American women.
Thank you so much, Chantel, for that concise yet courageous, bold recommendations for the direction we need to go. This now moves us and continues the conversation on women's and girls' rights, and it follows up on the important statement of women's rights are human rights that was announced and proclaimed at the Beijing Women's Rights Conference. I'll hand it over to London Bell now.
Thank you, Joshua. Hello, everyone. My name is London Bell, and I'm a member of the UNA USA Greater Detroit chapter. And our chapter worked in partnership with the Greater Chicago chapter, the UNA Kentucky division, Southern California chapters, Whittier chapter in California, and the UNA USA national headquarters. And all more than 60 organizations participated in our report focusing on the human rights of women and girls. And there's so many different issues that that are in the report around maternal health, human trafficking. One of the areas that I want to focus on are women migrants and asylum seekers, what's going on at the US-Mexico border. And so in our report, many of our participants expressed deep concern regarding the current administration's immigration policies of long-term detention and the separation of families and its disproportionate impact on women, migrants, and asylum seekers. Our information was gathered between April in August last year of 2019, but a lot has happened, especially within the last few months, that I'd like to share with you. So I actually saw a letter that was released on Friday, October 23rd, where 8 members of the U.S. House of Representatives sent a letter to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the Organization of American States, Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the UN Human Rights Council, and 14 UN special procedures of the UN Human Rights Council, actually requesting an independent, impartial, transparent inquiry into human rights abuses against detainees in the custody of the Department of Homeland Security and Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement facilities. That would be ICE. And so this letter is actually resulted from one of the most recent complaints on September 4th to the DHS Inspector General, alleging that a private doctor contracted by DHS performed partial or full hysterectomies and other gynecological procedures on women detainees, potentially without their consent. And so within this letter, and also going alongside with the concerns of our participants, there are other human rights issues that are happening at the border, including physical abuse, sexual assault, and gender-based violence against detained immigrants, deprivation to the right to freedom of religion, including feeding pork to detained Muslims and serving them expired halal meat that cause them to become ill, overcrowded conditions, including the lack of access to medical care, clean sleeping areas, lack of food, showers, soap, and even toothbrushes. 6 children have died from exposure to these conditions since December 2018. 21 people have died in ICE custody since October 2019, and 7 of them have unfortunately been linked to COVID-19. And October 21st, around October 21st, it was most recently reported the parents of more than 545 children who were separated from their families at the US-Mexico border cannot be located. So, and I want to echo Ryan's concerns about LGBTI individuals seeking asylum at the border. And in addition to the 3 young transgender women of color that he mentioned, one of the other issues that came out in our consultation is the challenge for transgender immigrants and refugees in seeking access to medical care, including getting hormone therapy, which is very important. So I would like to give you a few recommendations. Ensure protections for those seeking their legal right to asylum, including women and vulnerable populations. Ensure availability of healthcare as well as safety and sanity, safe and sanitary and dignified conditions in detention centers with a particular focus on women's health. Ensure the rights of immigrant families and children are protected no matter the legal status. Implementing additional cultural sensitivity trainings for immigration officers to ensure the fair treatment and equal rights of LGBT asylum seekers and refugees, and also to seek alternatives to the present detention center system, including emphasis on due process, justice, and humane treatment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, London, for that comprehensive overview of the important issue on women's and children's rights and of highlighting some of the horrible atrocities taking place at our border in the name of refugee control. We're definitely alarmed at that. We now move on to our final topic, one of the existential threats on Earth, climate. And I'm happy to introduce Ari Eisenstadt, also from Hawaii, and he'll begin our conversation on climate, and then I'll add just a small amount. Ari.
Thank you, and aloha, your excellencies. My name is Ari Eisenstadt, also reporting with Joshua Cooper. Want to express my gratitude and appreciation for all of your work on these really important issues. And I wish that we could all be together, but this is really a great opportunity to share virtually around the world on our human rights recommendations. I am currently representing the United Nations Association at the University of Hawaii. the Graduate Student Organization and Student Caucus, representing 50,000 students across all of the islands and 10 campuses. Currently a PhD student in future studies. And the way we look at future studies is scenario planning. And there are 4 different scenarios. There's continued growth, a linear positive growth, a discipline, imagining a recession, collapse where everything falls apart, and then transformation. And so today I'd like to talk about imagining transformational futures of climate action for human rights. Across these consultations, we've also done and issued reports on new types of transformational technologies, such as blockchain technology, outer space technologies for human rights. But today I'd like to discuss specifically climate issues and the environment. And this COVID pandemic really has shown how intersectional our social, economic, and environmental issues really are. And we're currently experiencing mass extinction of over 200 species a year, over 4 million premature deaths from fossil fuel-based air pollution every year, and billions of people's homes and communities are in danger from the climate emergency. However, there are many opportunities to address this crisis using indigenous solutions and exponential technologies for the environment. First, around indigenous solutions, the nation of Hawaii before Western contact was a great example of this with their Ahupua'a system, with the same current population of the island of Oahu, yet we're using all local resources. So we can turn to our indigenous communities around the world for climate action, and also apply these new space technologies of the 4th Industrial Revolution for Earth and beyond. And this is a key for solving these human rights issues on island Earth, as the navigators of the Polynesian Voyaging Society call it, before we can go to other planets, because you can't go outside and protest on Mars, for instance. So using these technologies, we need to invest in smart cities and also smart islands using these recommendations. First, around food, to support local, organic, humane, and sustainable food and agricultural sources. Water and sanitation, providing clean and accessible infrastructure for one of the most basic rights of water. To have cradle-to-cradle design for our consumption, of having everything going either back into the biosphere or technosphere. And finally, energy systems, and to invest in renewable, green, and decentralized energy production, and to divest from fossil fuel. And finally, we need to use our political institutions to legally protect life on land, life below water, and establishing environmental justice and healthcare for all people. Without natural capital, no business is profitable. However, when we honor the earth in these policies, we can also work to end poverty and thrive for all of humanity. Joshua, I'd like to turn it over to you to talk about the rest of our report. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ari, and definitely great to bring up the indigenous perspective. I think one of the most important things is, while we're looking at the climate crisis, we also face a biodiversity crisis. And we know there'll be a very important biodiversity conference hosted in China in the upcoming year. And we definitely think, unfortunately, the direction of the national policy is going in the wrong way if we are thinking of our planet and taking care of the natural resources. First and foremost, just last week, the Tongass National Forest in Alaska was actually open for exploitation for mining and logging companies. And what's really alarming about that is we all know how important trees are in the climate crisis. And this is the world's largest intact temperate forest. So unfortunately, even up to the point of the UPR, there are not even last-ditch efforts to try to seem like we're taking care of our planet and living up to our global obligations under the Paris Agreement. And of course, that brings up the point that we unfortunately have to say, it is November 4th. It is a day many of us were very concerned about. Not only do we have enough to be concerned about the election, but this was officially the day that the US would either remain a partner for Paris or a pariah. And we will see, depending on if the US will officially withdraw, because this would be the day, according to all the documents that were submitted, that would then be a definite move in the wrong direction. And we hope that that is not the case. Also, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25, talks about adequate standards of living. And we believe that's moving in the wrong direction. So our recommendations, and first and foremost, is to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement, consider climate change a national emergency, and mobilize all levels of government to build substantive partnerships with civil society, private sector, and other actors. And we've seen that the action, when it's lacking at the federal level, states pick up. Hawaii adopted the Paris Agreement. California took actions to decarbonize as well. And now we see private corporations and states trying to make up. And fortunately, we also see that solar is even more affordable than coal. So the transition makes sense economically and ecologically. The other step that we see a lot of important action is on eliminating the single-use plastics. That's absolutely crucial. The other thing that we must do is shift fuel subsidies from fossil fuels to renewables and promote their affordability, which we now know we've achieved, and investing in clean public transportation within cities and suburbs, as well as high-speed rail to connect cities and regions. We need to focus on electrification of transportation and make sure that science guides our national policies. We've seen that climate change has been scrubbed from national policy documents on websites, and we see a shift where we're putting in charge people who used to be lobbyists for the corporations that we're supposed to be monitoring. So we must reverse that action immediately and adopt the 10-year urban forestry action plan as well. And so these are just some of the issues we think are important. Agriculture is absolutely crucial as well. And we think that we must have a new approach for the future and know that we must all live together. So please, when you do have the floor, please make recommendations regarding United States policies and how it impacts climate in the United States on the coast. Also, as you can see, the wildfires that are raging out of control up and down the West Coast. And the sad thing is we've already gone through the entire alphabet for hurricanes in this season, and it's not over yet. So we're in the middle, on top of a COVID crisis, a climate crisis, and as many of the speakers have already explained, this crisis also exposed all the economic, social, and cultural rights and the inequalities that have persisted for too long in our country. We thank you all for your presentations. I really appreciate and always learn when I get to listen to the voices of fellow UNA members across the country. And more importantly, I see the solutions of what we can accomplish. And we know that last night and yesterday was our election day, and we know the world always wants to vote in the US election and watches it so closely. And the exciting thing is next week, the world gets to cast its vote. So for UN missions, we ask you to be our voice, to hold up the recommendations that have been shared with you today, because these recommendations and these questions that we're asking you to pose to the US are based on the real human rights challenges facing communities, and it's from directly impacted people who know what need to be changed. So if you want to make a recommendation and if you want to see a result, we can definitely partner together, and we look forward for you sharing and speaking on behalf of US civil society. And we also have hashtag campaigns of read my recommendation. That is an important way that you can also see other recommendations that are being done and also stand with US civil society. So those are two ways. That concludes the presentations from civil society. And I know we have a couple of missions and participants that are joining in Geneva. And we thank you so much for joining during your break before the next UPR starts. And we open the floor. If any of you have a question, you can either type it in the box, or you can also take the floor and be able to share as well. So thank you again, everyone, for your presentations, and thank you, missions, for joining us today. All right, we have no questions yet, but that's fair enough. We all just met, it could be a little shy. We can update the 1 to 2 pagers. So what was important is Ryan and Grace were so very instrumental and working to make sure that all the chapters were able to have their 5-page documents submitted. What we also have done since then in this next phase of interaction is prepare 1 to 2 pagers so we can share those and pass those out. If we were, of course, in Geneva on the week before the UPR as it normally is, we would be able to put all our 1 to 2 pagers on the back table, and you could just pick them up on your way in, and as well follow up as we saw each other in the hallways or at the Serpentine. But due to this COVID crisis, this is the best way that we can connect. So we could send to missions the 1 to 2 pager summaries. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks.
All right, if there are no further, I had a quote from Gandhi, I think, that really summarized the way many people in civil society feel, but are also so dedicated to a culture of human rights and fundamental freedoms. And it said, "When I despair, remember that all through history, the way of truth and love have always won." And it says, for a time, they can seem invincible if you look at many of the powerful and the tyrants, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. And that's also the similar statement that I remember hearing from Jose Ramos Horta. So we, the peoples, have spoken. We think there's many important recommendations that will make the UPR review actually worthwhile and promote positive social change in our country. If there are no questions, I'd like to hand it back to Rachel. And thank you so much, Rachel, for guiding the UNA USA. And it's been an exciting time so far to see how we've been able to adapt during the COVID crisis, but to still continue to advocate and keep Eleanor Roosevelt's vision alive in the United States and around the world. Rachel?
Yes, thank you, Joshua, and thank you all, especially the UNA USA leaders that presented today. As Joshua said, your voice is so important during this process, so I appreciate you being here. And once again, thank you to the UN missions and the UN Human Rights Council for engaging civil society on the UPR. We hope that our reflections and recommendations will support your work on the US's UPR. And as you can see, there's so much work to be done. So it is our hope that this process will shed a major light on the issues that we are facing in the United States and generate new advancements and ideas to improve human rights for all. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can either email me directly at rpittman, that's rpittman@unausa.org, or as you can see, Joshua has put his email in the chat box, Joshua Cooper, hawaii@gmail.com. You can reach out to him as well if you have any questions. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will be watching as this process continues. Thank you and have a good day.
All right.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate all your contributions.